Hello, my name is Raymond Dokabel, and today for our final project, we're going to be talking about China's language planning movement, the influence of Mandarin on the Hakka dialect. Let's get started. Okay, so in China, it's common to see Chinese subtitles displayed on TV broadcasts. The claim is that even though speakers of different dialects cannot understand Mandarin Chinese, they share a common character system and therefore are able to understand the written language with minimal differences in air quotes, because what we're interested in exploring here is whether those differences really are minimal or if there's actually any hindrance in understanding it. Is it actually true that with these Han Chinese subtitles, the Putonghua, the common speech, any speaker in China of any dialect would actually be able to read those without any confusion? Well, if that's true, then what we have is something that is hardly any different from a very thick accent. For example, if you had a very thick Scottish accent, the written text would be exactly the same. So it would be questionable whether we're actually dealing with something like an actual different dialect. Now, Chinese dialects are a little bit hard to define, and here's a graph that shows that Chinese is not something that we usually think of as Mandarin Chinese when we speak of Chinese, but actually there's a wide range of different dialects, of which Mandarin is just one of them. Now, the dialect Hakka is the one that we're going to be interested in exploring today. The way we want to define dialect is as the dialect continuum, because as we were shown before, what we might define as a different dialect may in fact just be a very thick accent, whereas we could actually go farther down the continuum and find something that resembles something that's almost like a totally different language. So that will be useful terminology moving forward. Here's a graph of China's literacy rate, which is useful for our research study because what we're going to be looking into is China's language planning movement. Now, language planning, as defined by Yule, are the 5 steps of selection, codification, elaboration, implementation, and acceptance, a top-down movement where the government implements a particular speech which they promote as the common speech. As is shown in the process of codification and elaboration, the promotion of this common speech is usually done through the publication of a dictionary and grammar, that's codification, and then the persuasion or promotion of that language through the publication of a literary corpus, that's elaboration. So the reason why we're looking at this graph here is because the language planning movement, which began in the late 19th century, took traction in the 1950s and really just kind of grew from there on. And you can see that it rose in tandem with the literacy rate. That makes sense because codification and elaboration are predicated on literacy. So in order for a language planning movement to actually succeed, we need to have literacy, and we can see how that spiked up since the 1980s. So my hypothesis for this research paper is that the rise in literacy affects the syntax, discourse, and semantics of non-dominant dialects to conform to the dominant dialect. And the research question I wish to explore today is how much does literacy influence the dialect continuum between Chinese Hakka, Kejiahua, and the Beijing dialect Putonghua? Why did I choose Hakka? Well, first of all, my mom is Hakka, and so that made it more interesting to me personally. The second reason is that they are nomadic. The phrase for Hakka is Kejiahua, which means guest people. Kejia means guest people. Kejiahua is the speech of the guest people. So there's actually a very wide range of dialects that the Hakka people speak. In fact, the version of Hakka that my mother spoke is, in fact, so obscure that almost only her family speaks it. So the reason why this is a useful selection is because there's a wider diversity of dialects, so we can gather a wider sampling among the dialect continuum. And that's to be contrasted with Putonghua, or the common speech, which is the selected speech which Beijing chose to be the official speech of the people. Well, let's talk about our methodology here. We're going to be gathering samples from Beijing, of course, because that will be our control, but also these various areas in southern China and in Southeast Asia, such as Taiwan, Hong Kong, and Macau. These are places there are the highest levels of Hakka speakers. Our study population will include the control, which will be a sample of literate Mandarin speakers from Beijing. And then we will be gathering our study group from a variety of different kinds of Hakka speakers, namely Hakka speakers who do not speak Mandarin. So we'll be collecting a sample of senior literate Hakka speakers that will be roughly between 1940 and 1960, people born between that time. Senior non-literate Hakka speakers, same time frame. Young literate Hakka speakers, 1980 to 2000 is roughly the age, and then young non-literate Hakka speakers. Now, the reason why we put this division at 1980 is because that's where the real boom in literacy happened, as we saw in the graph earlier. What are we going to be doing with this sampling of people? That leads us to method of data collection. First, we'll have two samples collected from the control group. The first sample will include them reading a written text, and then we will be asking them to give their interpretation of it, and their audio responses will be recorded. Secondly, they will be given a series of vocabulary words and asked to use it in a sentence. We're going to be collecting that data, and we'll be using the same text and the same vocabulary words on our study group. So next we're going to go to our study group, and we're going to go to the literate, and we'll be asking them to read a written text, the same written text we gave to the control group, in their own dialect. And the text will be in Mandarin or Putonghua, and we'll be testing out to see how well they can comprehend and interpret the text. So we'll be asking questions that test both comprehension and interpretation. That will be useful because that will tell us not only whether they can actually understand the text, but their interpretation will tell us whether there are actually sociological or sociolinguistic differences which may cause a linguistic divergence between the two of them. The illiterate sample that we're going to be studying will receive the same vocabulary words that we asked to control and be asked to use it in a sentence. Now, why we are looking at the illiterate, I will explain in a moment. What do we want to do with this data? For the literate, is there a correspondence in interpretation? Do they actually interpret the Mandarin text the same? The literate Hakka speakers and the Beijing speakers. For the illiterate, is there a correspondence in the vocabulary usage? Are they using the words that actually correspond with the written word, although the written word is the same, the pronunciation is different? We want to actually look at the written word and say, okay, you're actually using that character for essentially the same function. Or are there a number of different uses that you use for that particular character, and how do you actually use them in sentences? Are there noticeable speech differences between the old illiterate and the young illiterate? If there's no change, then that shows that the language planning didn't really have as deep of an effect as perhaps was intended. Lastly, what other syntactical or grammatical differences can be identified between the study groups and the control group? What are we hoping to accomplish in this study? Well, mainly what we're interested in discovering here is what are the total effects of language planning? How effective is it actually? In language planning, speakers often attempt to adjust their speech to conform to higher grammar or official speech. as we mentioned before, through the process of elaboration and implementation, the common speech becomes associated with status through the promotion of that speech through art. So these speakers will end up using that speech as a way to elevate their own status. But that's a conscious thing. My study hopes to ascertain whether language planning can also have an unconscious effect on the dialect continuum. That is why we must test the differences between the young illiterate and the old illiterate. Because if there is a significant difference, then that shows that even apart from education, there is actually a deep cultural effect that language planning or the implementation of and promotion of Putonghua actually had on these non-literate populations. That would show that the acceptance of the common speech was in fact total, and it was accepted from the bottom up and had effects that were for lack of a better word, natural to some extent. So that's what we're hoping to accomplish in this study. Hopefully it will be thorough and it would gain some interesting results. All right, that's it. Thank you.